Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to the Conservative Home Marquee. My name's Angus Parsad-Wyatt. I'm the Chief Executive of Conservative Home, and it's great to see so many of you here today for this conversation between Anand Menon and Ben Houchen. For 10 years, UK and Changing Europe has given us insights and analysis on everything from trade, immigration, the Brexit process, and a whole load of related issues. And it is very sad to learn in the last fortnight that their funding is now coming to an end. And so before we begin, I just want to say a huge thank you to Anand, his whole team, and everyone who's worked with UK ICE over the last decade. They've done a fantastic job, and a small part of that fantastic job is partnering with us every year for this conversation, which is always fantastic. So thank you, Anand, genuinely from us. Last year's conversation, one of these, was with Lee Anderson, who obviously shortly afterwards then defected to Reform. So Ben, please don't do that. Stay with us. So without further ado, please put your hands together for Ben Houchen and Anand Menon.
Thanks ever so much, Angus. It's always great to work with Conhome. I think we've done it for 10 years now, every year at Party Conference. Can I just reassure you, Ben, before we start, that a couple of years before Lee Anderson, we had Liz Truss, and she went on to be Prime Minister after this conversation, so you never know. Anyway, just by way of introduction, if he needs one, Ben Houchen is, of course, the Conservative Mayor of Tees Valley, and he has been since the combined authority was created in 2017. He's won 3 successive elections, nominated as a life peer in June 23, and was the former Conservative councillor in Stockton-on-Tees, where I was born, in fact. There we go. You see, we're like twins.
You were born in Stockton?
I was born in Stockton.
Oh, wow.
Yeah. So what we're going to do is just have a quick...
Easy interview, then.
I moved. What we're going to do is just have a conversation here on the platform for about half an hour, 40 minutes, and then pass over to you for questions. I want to start, Ben, I mean, it's the obvious place to start, with the recent election. You were one of the very, very few success stories for the Conservative Party in the election. Why?
To put it simply, it's because we delivered what we promised. It is that simple. There's obviously detail behind it, but over the last 3 elections, we've always under-promised and over-delivered. We've always said very clearly what we would deliver in a 4-year term of mayoralty, and we've delivered it. And the things that we've promised and delivered have made a materially positive difference to people's lives. That's how we've done it. And I think it's absolutely true. You can extrapolate from that certainly over the last probably 2 to 3 years, the Conservative government made lots of promises, didn't deliver any of them. People didn't feel any particular benefit, and arguably many people felt like things were getting worse. And I think there's a lot of noise and complexity that people like to add to it, but most people who are not interested in politics and don't like to interact with politics just look at every kind of election cycle and say, is my life getting better? Is it better? Or is it likely to get better in the way that I vote? And I think many people just thought where we got to in that period of time meant that they had to vote for somebody else.
I mean, was there more to it than that, though? I mean, part of the purpose of this conference is to review what happened and try and learn from mistakes. I mean, so there's a lack of delivery, which is clearly one element of it. There were a series of scandals, and after the local elections, you said party infighting was one of the culprits behind. I mean, just thinking back on the Conservative performance, I mean, how would you sort of rank the different potential explanations?
Yeah, I mean, you're absolutely right. There are different threads that contributed to it, but the main issue was because people don't interact with politics that much. It's is this a competent government that's able to deliver for me? Should I vote for them because the things that they're promising, I have a belief and a trust in them that they're going to do it? And what you found was, certainly in the last 2-3 years, a lot of the other things that come around it reinforced negatively that central theme that I think either consciously or subconsciously, that's how people cast their vote. So you can talk about the scandals in Westminster, the various ones from, Owen Paterson through to, many, Pincher and all the rest of it. You've got resignations, you've got backbench MPs or sometimes ministers going out on the airwaves disagreeing with government policy and what the government were doing. You ultimately had all of those things contribute towards it. But also, to give them the credit, and again, I'm not sure it's easy in hindsight to say this, but there were things also outside of their control which we're seeing are having a major impact on most Western democracies, like COVID, which, again, was out of our control, but then the consequence of that was our fault. So if you don't mind me explaining that. When you spend £500 billion of, in effect, new money, printed money of government spend on an economy, which you can argue the rights and wrongs of, but we did it, there are significant consequences that come out of that. And they're not just the immediate ones that everybody felt. The impact on the economy, the unwinding of supply chains, the oversupply of money, the fact that people were sat at home, in effect getting paid to sit at home. Lots of people saved money from a lot of that money they were getting from government, and that then had to unwind into the economy. That's not just in the UK, that happened elsewhere, albeit we gave the most favourable terms. That was something outside of our control. And there was always going to be that unwinding. And we need to somehow, in this next phase, try and help the public realise the actual economic consequences of that. And where we failed is we didn't do that. So it was really weird that after COVID, we almost, and I get why people, on a personal level wanted to do it, we tried to forget that COVID had happened and we just wanted to move on with our lives. But in political terms, we shouldn't have done that. And what the Prime Minister and what the government should have done is every single time they were interviewed about anything should have reinforced, we've just had COVID, we've just spent £500 billion, this is what it means, this is what it's going to do, and therefore this is informing our decision making. Instead, what we did was we made the decisions and we didn't explain the context as to why we were making those decisions. So we tried to pretend as if COVID was done, which actually opened the door to the Labour Party to say something which absolutely infuriated me during the election, which was, we've had 14 years of Tory chaos, which is demonstrably nonsense. And some people talk about, we didn't talk enough about what we did well over the last 14 years, which I agree with. But we didn't combat that with the issues around COVID, international energy pricing, war in Ukraine, etc., which allowed them to create that narrative. So that's a failure of comms, both in the election, in the run-up to the election. And you can't just run that argument in an election. You've got to fatten the pig before market day, and we should have started really towards the end of COVID and run that through. So that was a significant issue because, let's not forget, we won in 2010, we won in 2015, 17, massive majority in 2019. So people were pretty happy with 10 years of a Tory government. So what went wrong in that period? So like I said, there was COVID, war, all of the machinations of the Conservative government, all of those things that we did have control of that went wrong, which ultimately led to a perfect storm, which then led to the historic majority that Labour got and the devastation that we find the party currently in.
But you've got to add, though, that the Tories were slightly helped in 2017 and 2019 by who their opponent was.
All elections, of course, all elections are helped. But, when I was first elected in 2017, which was 6 weeks before the general election, so it was before the disastrous manifesto launch and the granny tax and all that kind of stuff, and the dementia tax. We were 25, 26 points ahead in the polls. Yeah. I don't get elected, and to be fair, nor does Andy Street in 2017 as the first mayors of our regions, if we weren't 20-odd points ahead in the polls. And again, there was a self-inflicted issue there that then meant that the election was much closer. So each individual election, you're absolutely right, there are ups and downs to it, but there was a perfect storm. I mean, COVID doesn't happen every day. You don't have wars that massively disrupt international energy supply chains and gas across Western Europe that impact the UK, that follows a global pandemic and all these types of things. It's not the excuse I'm giving, it's just the political communication of that didn't exist. In the same way, and the bit that I contrast it with is what happened in 2008. Yeah. Well, what Osborne and Cameron did after the crash in 2008 was brutally honest, 2 years out from an election, where we said, if you elect us, we're going to have to do these difficult things, and this is why. What we did in government was have COVID, had all other things, which was a much actually bigger economic shock than the crash in 2008. And we just said, we're going to do these things, but we didn't make the link to the public that it was because of something. And that then had an impact on, the out-of-touch Conservatives as well, which sadly we'd gotten rid of and was able to drip back into the 24 election.
I mean, in a way, Labour learnt the lesson from Cameron and Osborne quite well, didn't they? Because they, in a way, did to the Conservatives what the Conservatives had done to them 2008 to 10, which is to pin...
No, they absolutely didn't, though, did they?
They pinned the crisis on the Tories.
No, they didn't. Sorry, Anand.
No, it's fine. You can disagree.
I'm getting on my hobby horse now. In the election, they didn't do that. In the election, they sat there and said nothing, which is why they're having problems now in government. They sat there and said, we're not going to increase taxes, we're not going to increase borrowing, we're not going back to austerity, and this magical thing of growth is going to solve everybody's problems. And actually, at the time, they didn't say there was a major problem with the economy. They actually said, and Rachel Reeves is quoted many times on video and in the press as saying, we don't need to be worried about the financial numbers of this country because the governments over many years have strengthened the OBR. All of the figures are there to be seen. We know what the state of the public finances is. And I think, interestingly, because we're kind of moving on a bit here, because there are two separate points, They then got into government without telling anybody what they were going to do, and then turned around and said, we were elected to fix the economy and stabilise the economy, and it's absolutely terrible, and we didn't realise what it was going to be like, and God, the OBR is terrible, but we love the OBR, so we're going to give it more powers. And now we've found this massive black hole, and we're going to raise taxes, we're going to increase borrowing, we're probably not going to have austerity, we're going to change the fiscal rules. And they're having problems because the public don't buy it, because they didn't trail it. That's one of the reasons the government is having the problems that they're having. So they did it the wrong way around, and they did it because the Labour Party is in a more fragile position. Well, they were in the election in a more fragile position than people realise, but they were allowed to get away with it because nobody pinned them on what their actual policies were.
Okay, we'll come back to talk about the future a little bit towards the end, but just dwelling for a moment on 2025. I mean, one of the really interesting phenomena recently in politics has been the way that seats that, in my childhood would have been inconceivable for them to turn away from Labour, voting Conservative, and loads of those seats did that, including in your region. They voted for Boris Johnson. Why do you think, as a sort of starter for 10, why was he so successful in attracting voters that the Tories had struggled to attract in the past?
There is something that you can never explain about Boris Johnson, and I've tried to figure it out for the last 10 years. I mean, even longer, going back to when he was Mayor of London. He has a je ne sais quoi that you can't bottle. You either have it or you don't. And actually, I don't know of any politician in my time in politics that has what Boris Johnson has, and nobody can identify it. I mean, he came up to Teesside before I was mayor for the 2015 election to help out who was James Wharton, the MP for Stockton South at the time, in his re-election in 2015. And he was Mayor of London, so he wasn't a national politician. He walked down the local high street in Stockton, and he didn't even announce he was coming. We just turned up, obviously for security reasons, and he was mobbed. It was like One Direction had just turned up in the high street, and it was all ages. You literally had 16, 17, 18-year-old kids wanting selfies, banging on his car when he was getting in, all trying to get a glimpse of him. So there's this factor that Boris has that you just can't get away from. What he did really cleverly was convert that into the circumstances of the national politics at the time in the context of Brexit. And so he was an outsider as the Mayor of London coming into national politics, so his timing was very good, and he's a very good political operator in relation to that. Came in, and you even saw when he became leader, he ended up using the national platform to be the insurgent candidate, even though in effect at the time he was the Prime Minister of the country. It was the anti-establishment, it was the system that was stopping him, it was the Labour Party, it was the Speaker of the House, it was Parliament, all the issues of proroguing, it was even the Supreme Court and the ridiculous diamond spider that was on her jacket from Lord Hale and things like that. He used that thing that he had and twisted it into being something new, which then allowed the Conservative Party to regenerate after 10 years of government, which then in effect saw him as the opposition and the insurgent candidate. And the other thing that people miss, because Brexit is a huge part of it, and all of that I've said explains it, the thing that people underprice in that conversation was then also the levelling up agenda on the side of it.
Yeah.
So I'm in the insurgent candidate, the system's trying to keep you down, they're not going to listen to you, they're not listening to your Brexit vote. And by the way, I also get it. I get that places like Teesside, Hull, Bolton, Grimsby, we can name them all across the country, you've been neglected. You haven't had any investment. The government doesn't talk about you. They don't care about you, and they haven't done for decades. But I get it, and this is what we're going to do in levelling up. And when you pair that with what was the system at the time and how he managed that so well, that's why he won the majority that he did. And he's an incredibly, incredibly accomplished political operator to pull it off.
Did the Conservative Party as a whole get it? I mean, that was one of the... When you heard Boris Johnson talking about levelling up, we thought, oh, this is new. Because a lot of people in those parts of the world, blamed the Thatcher government for what they were living through and the fact that industries had gone. But do you think the party as a whole was convinced, or was it just a veneer that they were quite happy to shed once Boris was out of the way? Well,
the cleverness of the Boris Johnson levelling up agenda was that he moved on from what was the Northern Powerhouse.
Yeah.
Which was obviously created by George Osborne in particular and David Cameron when, in effect, he started devolution. And the reason he did that is he knew that there was a party that, and actually a parliament in general, but certainly a party where elements were actually envious of the Northern Powerhouse and this new and revived concentration of deprived areas, but particularly the north of England that felt like it had been underinvested in for a long time. And they felt left out because they weren't part of the north. And in some justification, there were some MPs in areas of the country that are not in the north of England. I mean, this is an obvious thing to say. There are some areas in this country outside of the north of England that have equal areas of deprivation and poverty and problems that they face that are in the south of England. And levelling up was a wonderful twist where he could incorporate the Northern Powerhouse into the whole country.
Yeah.
And it was just so invigorating because it is not a joke to say. I remember immediately after the election, I went to an event in Hartlepool, and a young woman came up to me, who must have been in her early 30s, and said, I voted Conservative. I voted Conservative for the first time ever. I believe in levelling up. I voted for you. And it was that thing that I've always said is people genuinely had belief that it was going to be different, and they put their trust in us. This is someone who said, I've never voted before in my life. She's in her early 30s. My family have never voted. But we just believe in it. And actually, the unwinding of that and the lack of delivery in large parts of the country, pretty much outside of Teesside and maybe one or two other pockets, also compounded the result in 2024 as a broken promise, because we didn't fulfil a promise that was so prized by the general public that they felt like they had to punish us for it.
So how does the party win back the trust of people like that woman in Hartlepool?
Well, this is the million-dollar question, because the problem, it's not just the academic question of what do we do, because we have to do it in the context of us being in opposition.
Yeah.
And the problem we have is we can talk about trust and confidence and competence, but we have no ability to show delivery of it. Now, I can, as mayor, because I'm still in office, so we can pull levers and actually do things. But in opposition, you're not in charge of services or government. So how do you demonstrate that? Well, first of all, if we go back to basics of, sorry to kind of go slightly off piece, Anand, but what does the Conservative Party have to do to demonstrate that in its fundamental terms? The starting point is, let's just all be aware of this in the room, it was our fault that we have a Labour government. The Labour government didn't win this election, we lost it, and it's our fault that the country is being inflicted with this Labour government. The country knows this. And at the moment, nobody cares that there's a Conservative Party contest. Nobody cares that there's a conference going on. They're not listening to us. So the first thing, before we can even think about how we rebuild our relationship with the electorate, is we've got to figure out a way of getting them to listen to us again. Just full stop. They're just not going to listen to us. So, and it's been the really frustrating thing that I found about the leadership contest so far, never mind at conference. And hopefully we might hear some things in the next 24 hours from the candidates. They've all identified the problems, and we all know the problem. Competence, trust, lack of delivery, infighting, etc., etc., etc. We know it, right? It's not rocket science. The public know it. None of them have explained how they're going to rectify that. They've identified, they've made the diagnosis, but they've not identified the cure for that. And the worry is that somebody is going to get elected on the 2nd of November. It doesn't really, for me, it doesn't matter who it is, in the sense that that's not the job done. Their biggest challenge is going to be rebuilding the party, but somehow, over the next months, if not years, get to a position where the country will start listening to us again. Now, I've in effect done the same thing. I've set out the diagnosis of what we need to do and not really diagnose the cure for it. I don't know what the answer is, but I think it goes back to, and if I was in charge, what would I do? I think we've got to go back to understanding what the public care about and creating a story that taps into the hearts and minds of where the public are at, and try to reconnect with their morals and their values, so that at the very best, probably over the coming months, if not the next year or two, that the people start to think that we're not out of touch, that we do get it, and that we get why we got it wrong and why the public kicked us out. I think that's the best we can expect in the short term, to allow us even a fair hearing, hopefully, to start to build a policy platform beyond that.
I mean, it always seems to me that the key to successful opposition is an unpopular government. So we've had 90-odd days of this government. What have you made of them so far?
I mean, I wasn't expecting many things from them, and I don't mean that glibly, but they have been worse than I thought they were going to be. And it's interesting to compare it to 97, and it goes back to this point that I think is slightly academic, but I think is pretty fundamental to understand.
Academic's a good thing.
Well, it is. It depends. Maybe ask Kelly. Sound bites matter, don't they? If you go back to 97, people actively voted for Tony Blair because they believed in the vision and where he wanted to take the country. You can agree or disagree with it, but they bought into it and they actively voted for him. This point that I made earlier, where people didn't actively go out and vote for the Labour Party, they actively went out to kick out a Conservative government. And there are examples across this country, I know, where people on the doorstep were saying, do I vote Lib Dem or do I vote Reform? You know, that's not the natural conversation where it's like, do we lurch to the right to ape reform, or do we just concentrate on the Liberal South and retake our heartlands? It misses the point entirely of what we need to achieve. And this government, I think in hindsight, was always going to underperform because people didn't vote for it. They voted against us. They are clearly not prepared for government, which has been the biggest shock to me. They've had a long time in opposition. They must have known they were going to win the election. I think it's probably fair to say in this room, we all saw it coming for a while. Maybe not the size of the result, but we saw it coming for a while. And I would have thought, again, if I was in their shoes, I would have had the first year planned out, week by week. You would have had it planned out about what you're going to announce, the types of things you're going to do, the framing of the conversation. And it genuinely seems like they've kind of walked in and thought, okay, now we've won the election, we need to think about government. And you can see it from some of the stuff they're doing. They're still talking like they're in opposition, which is causing them some of the problems. And it's bizarre to see. And again, I think that goes back to the point that they haven't been tested. Keir Starmer's not been tested. Where he was tested in 2020, 2021, when Boris was in charge. You look at the Hartlepool by-election, my election in 21 was on the same day. He nearly resigned because he didn't like Boris, because Keir Starmer doesn't get the politics of it. And I think one of the biggest things, and I know the biggest victory that Labour HQ had at the time, was getting rid of Boris. They knew he was our biggest success at the time. And we can talk about the problems with Boris, of which there are many. I'm not saying that Boris didn't come with a load of baggage, nor am I saying that Boris would have necessarily won the election given everything that's happened in the interim. It's just that this government is clearly not ready for it, and we're seeing it in different terms. Like I say, post-election, they've tried to change the rules of the game, that the country are not buying around £22 billion black hole. You cannot square the circle of the country's in a mess, even though we told you it wasn't because we said we saw the numbers, but we're going to give union paymasters a massive pay rise. We're going to take a load of freebies, and at the same time, that juxtaposition of the winter fuel payment being cut. There is no narrative and vision from this government that the public can hang on to, and that is going to continue to cause them a problem. And hopefully, on the 2nd of November, a leader can grab onto that quite quickly so that we can help define the Labour government and that first impression, which again is just one little crack in the wall that we can cling on to that helps us build from there on in.
So hand on heart, do you think the Conservatives can win the next election?
Yes. I mean, it's a very simple question to say that. So yes, we can. But it feels to us like we're having the conversation no differently to the Labour Party did after the 2019 election. If anybody had told you they were going to win the biggest majority, probably, I don't know, in the last 100 years or whatever for the Labour Party, or if ever for the Labour Party, no one at the Labour conference would have believed you. So, of course, it's possible. Is it likely? No, it's not. But it can be done. So we should make sure we try because, I'm a Conservative because I believe that genuine Conservative principles are good for this country and that socialism and the way this Labour Party is going to go is going to be bad for the country. And my priority is making sure that we do what we can for the country. We can't do that in opposition. So we all have to try. We all have to fight as hard to make that possible. We have to cling on to that hope, which I think is some of the energy and the optimism we see at conference, because members want a bit of hope to be able to reset the party and go again. But it doesn't mean that it's likely. And I do think it could, not in electoral terms, but it could get worse for us before it gets better. There could be some false dawns, false starts. There could be some setbacks, and there will be over the months and years ahead. There inevitably are, given where we are as a party. But we've just got to hold fast to our morals and principles and start to rebuild that conversation with the public. And, I'm forever an optimist. Of course it can happen.
Now, you touched on this before about that choice, if you like, or that debate about whether the party needs to turn rightwards or leftwards. The Theresa May article sparked a big debate along this. And I think you were on record a while back as saying that if a candidate like Suella Braverman was elected, the Tories could be in opposition for years. What is the strategy you think the new leader should pursue?
So that was a nuanced, I can't remember the specific interview I gave on that, but I'll have known that the nuance to that was not necessarily Suella Braverman. I mean, she has perfectly valid views on things like immigration, obviously. She's been very forthright in that. For me, it was sometimes in politics we all know it's not necessarily the message, it's the right messenger.
Yeah.
And Suella, I think, has gone on a bit of a journey, in my personal view, where she was saying some of the right things, not all of the right things, but she was clearly the wrong messenger if we wanted to reconnect with the public and be the broad church that the Conservative Party is. I'm a bit of a strange creature, I think, because I get this question a lot about where does the party need to go. When I got elected on the promise of nationalising an airport, but I'm proud to say that I was responsible for the most free market policy the Conservative government delivered in free ports. That's the most free market thing we did in 14 years of government. And so people try and kind of pigeonhole me into kind of as an interventionist rather than maybe a free marketeer side. And I think I always go back to it. It's pragmatism. It's not about the left and right. We have to, and Andy Street has a very good analogy on this. You know, if you're running a business, you have confidence in what you believe in, you have confidence in your strategy, you have confidence in what you have to offer, your beliefs and principles, whether it's a service or a product that you're delivering, and you don't need to worry about everybody else. We've got to have confidence in our own beliefs of small government, personal responsibility, all of, good economic management, all of the things that we know. And I just worry, and we've seen, to be fair, we've seen it over the last 2 or 3 years. We've seen us trying to ape or reflect what we think people want us to be, instead of having confidence in our own conservative principles of strong families, strong communities, strong economies, individual responsibility, individuals' freedoms, espousing the benefits of free market economics, making sure, and again, the nuance there is, and I think modern conservatism is about, there is a role for the state in a small way to be able to, one, from a commercial point of view, create the environment in which the private sector can thrive. But also we're in a new world, particularly post-COVID, and whether this will last or not, that people expect more from the government. And part of our story has to try and move the public back into the centre ground, because I think it's gone slightly centre-left, so that we can have more open conversations about, capitalism, free market economics, freedom. God forbid, somebody said to me the other day that freedom of speech is a new right-wing kind of ideology that we've somehow acquired from the left. It's like, well, for as long as I've been alive, I always thought freedom of the individual and free speech was always a conservative mantra. So it's much more complicated than that. And I just think we've got to put our best foot forward and have a belief in what we can offer. And this whole thing, like, Reform voters were Conservative voters. They voted for us previously. Lots of Conservatives who didn't vote and stayed at home want to come and vote for us but felt like they couldn't. Lots of people who voted Lib Dem have probably voted for us in the past in the South and the South East and North East Hampshire and all the other places where they won, I suspect, have voted for us before. So the idea we have to pick and choose is wrong. It's the premise of the question is incorrect. It's not about having to pick a side. It's about refinding what it is to be a Conservative and getting back to basics and understanding what's made us the most successful electoral force in the Western world.
Isn't one of the problems, though, that there are so many competing and conflicting views of what conservatism is and should be? I mean, the one thing that you see at this conference, you've seen it at a conference over the last few years, is this is a party that is deeply divided on some fundamentals, on economic policy, on values. I mean, is it possible to bring it all together coherently at this point?
I think the government towards the end became very technocratic. And given the problems that we faced in the last couple of years of government, we almost gave up governing and kind of ceded decision-making really to the civil service. And that's my personal opinion on what I saw. It was very difficult to get a minister to stick their head above the parapet and take a principled position on something and actually say yes or no to something. I think that's different to where the Conservative Party was at. I mean, from the people that I know within the Conservative family, I don't think there's a huge disparity on economics. I think there is a range because we are a broad church, but I think all people in the Conservative Party are centre-right, and you can move slightly further. And we do have if you would listen to the mainstream media, we have a large kind of libertarian thread through the Conservative Party. I don't see that. There is obviously a small element, and we are part of a broad church, so that conversation can happen. But I think Conservatives are relatively sensible, free market, centre-right economically. I do think, so I don't agree on the economic side,
right,
really. I just think there are a range of views that sit within a sensible range. On the cultural side, I do think there's more of a spread. And that is going to be a bit of a challenge for the new leader, where we still have a proportion of the Conservative Party that is very socially conservative. For example, I won't name names, but I know there are a large group of people who think we need to go back to basic values around the core of the family. Mm-hmm. Making sure that we have family-friendly policies that encourage people to grow a family, to grow communities. There is also true to say there is an element of the Conservative Party that wants to become a lot more liberal in that sense and say, the family is almost kind of the nuclear family, the family in general is almost like an outdated, unmodern concept in modern Britain, And I think there will be some conflicts there, and that tends to play out. And interestingly, I do think there is a conversation that isn't really being had about the family in particular in the Conservative Party that we need to have. But that tends to therefore play out in things like, very simply, in things like the woke, transgender ideology, etc. Yeah. And that tends to be the space that conversation goes on in. But there's much more to that, where there is, I think, quite a diverse, socially conservative view, which we somehow need to consolidate around a set of principles, because that's also one of the reasons we've seen the lack of unity, particularly within the parliamentary party, because how do you unify around things? Even if you don't agree on every single decision, you have to unify around principles and a cause. And I think we lost that cause, which allowed particularly members of the parliamentary party to feel like they had free rein to openly disagree with government and cause all sorts of problems and see all the things that we saw over the last couple of years.
Okay, I just want to ask you a couple more questions before I open it up to the audience. I mean, the first is about devolution and the role of mayors. I mean, are you in favour of further devolution? Are there powers you would like to have that you haven't got that you think you could feasibly have?
Shock! I am in favour of more devolution. Right. Yeah, I am in favour. Of course, I am. And again, I think it's something that we should take more ownership of. Because let's be honest, we've flirted with this on and off for a long time. George Osborne, obviously huge proponent of devolution, actually was the man that got it over the line with the first round of mayors, etc. To be honest, it went off the boil with Theresa May and Philip Hammond in the Treasury. Obviously came back with Boris in a principled way, but the delivery of devolution, there were some stops and starts. I think it's probably fair to say Rishi was not against devolution, but was a bit more lukewarm than Boris was. And I think we've got to own devolution, because it feels like a very sound Conservative principle to me, that we give the responsibility and the accountability and also the opportunity for local people to have more say and control over the people that they elect. And I think directly elected mayors on a regional level, with powers taken away from the centre and Westminster and located back in their regions through a directly elected and accountable individual that you elect directly rather than through some sort of local council decision and then your councillors elect a council leader. There is something very empowering in that. And I think the Conservatives should grab onto it. And we're actually seeing from this Labour government, it's really causing them a problem, because their rhetoric on devolution, actually, to be honest, is very good. And if you listen to the rhetoric that Keir Starmer and Angela Rayner have said, I can't disagree with any of it. But I don't think the reality will follow through, because their rhetoric around more powers to areas and giving up control is diametrically opposite to what they believe, which is central planning and control. And we're seeing it with national industrial strategies, national jobs plan. So, well, I'm responsible for, in effect, a local industrial strategy that I decide on as a directly elected mayor for the people I represent. How does that then work if you're going to give me more powers, but then tell me through your national industrial strategy what I can and can't do? And it's the same for the job stuff. They want to give us more powers over jobs, DWP, etc., to be able to align economies with skills and people getting back into work, etc. But they want a national jobs plan. So how am I supposed to link into a national jobs plan when you're supposed to also, in effect, give up control? And it's going to grind into the sand. And we're seeing this with the Treasury at the minute around what they call growth plans, which are in effect local industrial strategies. And government are in effect coming to me and saying, your priority is chemicals, renewables, and biosciences. So that's what you should spend all your money on. So they're in effect telling us what our local priorities are. And they're doing it for the whole country. And then they're going to say, here's a whole lot of money, but you can only spend it on those things. And they're going to get themselves into a place of what I call decentralisation rather than devolution. And I think, again, I see there's a huge opportunity for the Conservative Party to re-grab that policy framework in opposition, which again could go back to the point we talked about before, which is setting out an agenda where we can show competence and tap into, Conservative principles, but also into the public that I think would resonate really well with local communities.
Is it not just one of those rules of political life that it's quite easy to talk about devolution in opposition, but you get more reluctant to do it when you're in government?
The issue with English devolution, so I'm in this context specifically talking about English devolution rather than national devolution in Scotland and Wales. My experience over the last 7 years is you can only actually deliver devolution through the Treasury. Because ultimately it doesn't matter what the departments say. None of the departments want to give up power. That's the practicalities of government. It's a civil service thing. Some of the ministers, past and present, are also against devolution, but many are in favour of it. But devolution doesn't work unless it comes with the release of finance as well. And that only works if you have a chancellor politically who is going to drive through devolution. The only reason we have devolution was not because the civil service thought it was a good idea and the MHCLG back in 2015 through James Wharton, who was the Northern Powerhouse Minister, and I can't remember who the Secretary of State was at the time. that wasn't why it happened. It happened because George Osborne saw it as a policy that he wanted to drive through, and actually in opposition to many Treasury civil servants, he drove it through. He basically told departments this is happening. He in effect bypassed the departments, and Treasury, with a little help from obviously MHCLG on a practical basis, forced those deals through. Mm-hmm. So the interesting thing is Angela Rayner is saying the right things, and I've had lots of conversations with Angela, and her head and heart is in the right place. It's not Angela that we've got to look out for, it's the Treasury. And the Treasury, at this moment in time from the conversations we're having, are not pro-devolution. Now, I say that in Treasury terms, not Rachel Reeves terms, because I've not spoken to Rachel Reeves about it. But it would require a strong Chancellor to push through devolution. So unless her heart is really in it, I don't necessarily think we're going to see the step change in devolution that we need, and certainly the step change that the Labour Party need to make to stop us from regaining the initiative on this agenda.
I've got to ask you before I open it up, what's it been like in the first few months working with a Labour government as the only remaining Conservative mayor? It's
been all right, really. It's been a bit weird. So a couple of days after they won the election, Keir Starmer invited all the mayors into Downing Street, and I went along, and he was kind enough to invite me in before that meeting, and I had a private meeting with him and Sue Gray for about 20 minutes, because we'd never met before. Mm-hmm. And so he didn't have to do that. He could have met me with all of the other mayors. So I appreciate his opportunity to do that. And he offered, I'm a very straightforward person. I'll take people at face value until they give me reason not to. And he was very open, said he wanted to work with me. I've started to create this strange relationship with Sue Gray, who seems to be my point of contact in Number 10, and she's very helpful and responsive to some issues that we've had. So I can only take them at face value. But we are in this space of kind of a weird Mexican standoff where I'm working with them and they're kind of working with me, but we're both like, are you going to put your gun down? It's like, well, only if you lowers yours, and we're both kind of gently lowering our guns. So we'll see whether that plays out, but invariably, I hope it lasts for a long time, because I just want to get on and deliver what I want to deliver and do the things that I can do for the people I represent. But I think invariably at some point politics will interfere, but hopefully that's a way off. At the minute, it's going okay, but we'll see.
I mean, devolution does create some weird political dynamics, doesn't it? Like, you might find yourself working very closely with the Labour government. Labour mayors might find themselves at odds with the Labour government.
Well, I think we'll see that. And this is the interesting thing I find with the Labour Party. The Labour mayors genuinely thought that if only we had a Labour government, it would all be perfect and we'd get all the things we want, because they're so blindingly obvious. A Labour government would obviously give them to us. You know what's happened? Actually, the Labour government probably aren't going to give them what they actually wanted. And there is a lot of disquiet amongst Labour mayors about that, because all of a sudden the realisation, the reality of having a Labour government is not necessarily the same as the rhetoric. And I do think one of the interesting things to look out for, probably over the next 12 months, will be some of the friction between the Labour mayoral group, and obviously you've got people like Andy Burnham and Sadiq Khan in that, who are part of that group. And I think that we will see some flare-ups directly with the Labour government, particularly over the devolution agenda. And then there are obviously egos and personalities and Labour politics overlaid in that, which is always fun to watch.
Brilliant. I think we have a mic somewhere. You all right to take a couple of questions?
Absolutely, yeah, I'd love to.
Do you want to start at the front? We'll work back.
I've got 2 mics, so you can take 2 at once, or do you want 1 at once?
Whatever you give. Please keep your questions short, please, and just say your name before you ask.
Okay, PJ Srow. There's so many different layers of government, national, and also unitary or district or parish. Do we need regional government? And regional funding, will that solve our problems, or should it be all to do with mayors?
That was a model short question, thank you.
Yeah, Logistics UK. You mentioned the contradiction between regional devolution and national control. Do you see a contradiction between market economy and decarbonisation, and how to achieve that? And where do you see, or where would you encourage whoever becomes the leader of the Conservative Party to fall on that balance of driving decarbonisation or supporting whatever the market comes up with?
So what was my views on each of the leaders' position on it, did you say?
Yeah, or where would you like them to
where
end
would I
up?
like them to be? Sorry, I'm just making a note. So on the first point, I'll talk specifically around mayors rather than local government reorganisation. But again, it's one of the things that this government is going to have to consider. So the Labour mayors want, I think all of them do, they all want more powers across a much broader range of things. They want to take over health, they want to take over all sorts of wonderful things. My view on devolution, particularly mayoral devolution, is the opposite of that. I think the reason we've been successful as mayors generally is because we are not broad, we are narrow in our remit around economic regeneration and growth and jobs and investment. So in effect, the old regional development agencies, we are politically accountable regional development agencies. So that narrow remit, I think from a public body perspective, it goes into a wider public sector organisation. Having a narrow remit of a public body allows it to be more efficient and more effective. And the more you broaden that out with things out of that remit, it actually makes it more cumbersome and the bureaucracy grows. And what this government is going to have to decide is, does it want us to become a slightly weird version of a local authority that does kind of a little bit of everything and nothing particularly well? Or does it want us to do what we do now, but give us more money and powers that contribute to that? So rather than broadening us, give us deeper powers in what we've already got control of. That would be my preference. The decarbonisation stuff is really interesting because I think it's going to be a big challenge both for the government and for the Conservative Party over the next couple of years, particularly with the spectre of reform in the background as well. So we all know Reform's position around basically net zero is a scam and it's just costing everybody the fortune, and if you got rid of it we can lower bills and we can go back to oil and gas, etc., which there are some nuggets of truth in that, which is why it works well and resonates on a fundamental level with the electorate who are feeling it in their pocket. The Labour Party, and particularly with Ed Miliband, are going to go far too quickly, and that is going to undermine the decarbonisation strategy in this country, which in relative terms has been pretty successful. You can argue around the edges, around timings, etc., and some of the regulations, but in broad terms, we've certainly led the world on it. We could have captured more opportunities, like in offshore wind, for instance, where we lost that to other countries, solar, etc., where we've lost that to the Far East. But there is a big opportunity in market economics terms for being able to lead the development of new technologies, create the new technologies in IP in this country, create the skills base in this country, roll it out in this country, but then have an incredible export opportunity where we in effect rebuild the world with these new technologies. And Teesside's a great example of that, particularly through things like carbon capture and storage, where we'll be building the world's first industrial-scale carbon capture and storage facility, which will absolutely, once built, be exported around the world, and the same model will be taken to Japan, Qatar, North America, Canada, and everywhere in between. The politics will get involved in decarbonisation, though, because none of the national political parties have been brutally honest with the public around the actual consequences of implementation of decarbonisation. And that's about the underwriting of contracts for difference in offshore wind is misrepresented by some as a demonstration of how expensive offshore wind is, when actually, when you get below that, I believe it doesn't demonstrate that as a floor price for CFDs, when actually the cost of energy has been higher than that anyway. So actually it's not costing the government anything to underwrite that because the cost of energy is higher. But a reform argument would be, well, look, it's like 70, 80 pounds a megawatt hour, and actually gas is only, 30, 35, and therefore it's more expensive. It negates all of the nuance. I personally think, I don't know which one of them it'll be, but I think we may see one or two of the candidates try and steal the clothing of reform a little bit on it and try and row back and demonstrate it as a common sense approach to lower bills, whereas we know our energy system is much more complicated than that. And also, I actually think out of everything, and I don't know which way things like immigration are going to go, but I do think one of the biggest opportunities the Conservative Party has, actually much more significantly than devolution, for us to be able to get charge of a sensible agenda is through energy and our energy policy, because I do think the Labour Party are going to make some huge mistakes that are going to impact everyday people. They're going to see it on a daily basis. They're going to blame the government for it, and we need to be ready with a measured and sensible energy policy that doesn't then fall foul of reform that just goes for a very overly simplistic kind of opposition message. Because there is a risk that if we don't get ourselves right, so there's a responsibility to us in opposition to do this, if we don't get that right, people will go for the simple message of reform, and I think that would be the wrong thing as well. But we could do hours and hours just on energy policy, and I know that, others have questions to ask as well.
That was very Keir Starmer, the politics of complexity.
Yeah, well, it's complex and not complex at the same time.
Gentleman
Marco Forgione, the Chartered Institute of Export and International Trade. Lord Houchen, you've been incredibly effective in attracting inward investment into teas, but both the previous government and the current government see that the only way we can genuinely grow the economy is through exports, and you mentioned it briefly there. What do you think the government has to do to really spark that growth in exports, both for our larger business, but more importantly, the MSME community, micro, small and medium enterprises?
Nolan Gray, Atkins Realis. Ben, I think you undersold yourself when you said you under-promise and over-deliver, because I think some of the things you've delivered are phenomenal. But because you're the only real Conservative in power with the opportunity to continue to deliver, do you think the focus should move away from Westminster and onto Teesside so that you can continue to deliver and show the world or show the rest of the country what Conservatism can do?
Did you plant him?
Well, I was about to say, it's very kind of Nolan to say that. Full disclosure, Nolan used to work for me at the Combined Authority in Teesside. And actually, to be fair to him, Nolan and I worked very, very closely on the delivering of the Teesside Free Port. So Nolan's gone on to bigger and better things, advising the country on how we can reap the benefits of free ports across the country. So if anybody wants some technical advice, not that I'm being paid in any way, shape or form by Nolan, but he is a great guy to speak to. So yes, that's very kind of you, Nolan. I'll pick up that point first. I mean, it's nice for the leadership contenders to talk about me and Teesside quite a lot, because I think one of the things we're going to have to see, because it goes back to the point of how do you demonstrate competency and delivery in opposition, that's going to be done through local government first. We have elections in May. Given where the Labour Party are, it gives me a chink of hope that actually we can start to build that base back up, become the largest party in local government again, which we lost for the first time in a long, long time last year. And it's through those fantastic councillors taking back controls of councils and delivering common sense local policies, again, on an ultra-local level, making sure that potholes are filled in, making sure that your bins are emptied properly, making sure that local services are run properly. And if you demonstrate it at that ultra-local level, again, it creates an environment in which the public will then listen to us on a national level, where we can say, we've got an amazing local Conservative council, they've changed things, look at the benefits that they're bringing, we can do that on a national level. So I do absolutely think that could be the case, and I'm always happy for the government to shine, or the opposition now, to shine more of a light on the great things we're doing in Teesside, and I think they will do that as a demonstration of how the Conservative government can help people. I think from Marco, again, disclosure, we do some great work with Marco, who runs the Institute, and they do incredible things for helping small businesses across the country looking at exports. I think I would just echo the stuff that we always talk about, Marco, which is providing. It's incredible the mental block that individuals who are starting their own business or existing businesses, particularly in the SME community, who think that exporting and starting to export outside of the UK is somehow some huge leap that's really complicated and it feels a little bit too difficult to get involved with. And I echo the recommendations that you keep pushing, is we need to look at how do we provide almost kind of an advice, well, I say you're already providing the advice service. Maybe we could provide more support to you guys to expand and see how we can engage more effectively with local communities, because you're absolutely right. You know, the more we export, the more sustainable small businesses are that export compared to businesses that don't export. I think there's also some, in broader terms, and I talked about this yesterday at another event, there are some things we could do as a Conservative Party to reset the conversation over Europe as well. And I say this, I'm a Brexiteer through and through, and I still believe that Brexit was the right thing, and I think that actually the implementation of Brexit, there are things that we got wrong, but that doesn't mean that Brexit was the wrong thing. It just means that taking back control and sovereignty, you have a government that you should hold more to account, and the government didn't quite get the implementation of Brexit right. So we can still solve that issue and make it better, and actually things are going quite well in the UK if you look across the way to our partners in Europe who are having a hell of a time of it. But I think what the Conservative Party now needs to do, we're out of government, we need to have a more grown-up conversation about Europe and move beyond the conversation about Brexit. Actually, I've just introduced it by saying, oh, well, I voted for Brexit. We actually need to stop framing it in those terms and saying, Brexit has happened, we are now no longer part of the EU. So if the EU was on the other side of the world, how would we want to interact with this trade bloc? And we've got to see it on sensible commercial trading terms, as we would with the Americas, the CPTPP, there's lots of other trading blocks around the world. How do we interact with that in a sensible way? So, for example, and I would say this in Teesside, there are chemical regulations that we've mirrored on Brexit, but are not recognised by the EU. And to be honest, that's petulance on largely the EU side. But we in effect have the same regs, but the EU don't recognise it. It causes a level of non-financial friction in the market of moving chemicals backwards and forwards. It doesn't seem to me a huge stretch to have mutual recognition of chemical regulations and standards with the EU. It is inappropriate and wrong to say that that is a level of giving up sovereignty. It's not. If we were to do the same deal with America or Canada, there is going to have to be a mutual recognition of rules that you contractually agree to on a free basis as a sovereign country to work in cooperation with another country. That's how we've got to start to see Europe, rather than, if you were having this conversation, I suspect probably today, outside of this room anyway, you would get a part of the Conservative Party that says, this is about level playing field, this is about restricting us, this is about alignment, this is about the EU stopping us from growing. It's saying, actually, we've got to have a more sensible discussion. And actually, the EU will try and do that, but that's about a strong, competent government saying, actually, we are happy to agree this, but that's going too far, and we can do that as a sovereign nation. Whereas at the minute, things like chemical standards, and there are a few others, certainly while we were in power over the last couple of years, we didn't get there because of this inability for us to move beyond Brexit and look at EU as a friend and a genuine trading partner that can help us grow our economy from the outside of the EU.
Can I just ask you a couple of follow-ups on things you've just said?
This is your thing, isn't it?
No, I was about to actually...
God, I forgot about this.
The first follow-up was actually about local elections, because aren't next year's local elections going to be a bit of a nightmare for the Conservatives? Because the last time these seats were contested was vaccine bounce. I mean, you're dealing with local elections on the back of a very strong Tory performance last time, so I wonder whether it's wise to build them up.
No, I'm not building them up, but it is a first test, and it's, again, I suppose to put a bit more meat on those bones, it's not necessarily about us making huge strides, because we're not going to win thousands of seats in the May election, but it is also important that we don't see another huge drop-off. We've got to get our act together. The leader's going to play an important role in setting that scene. Local activists and councillors are. The worst thing that could happen for the Conservative Party is if we lost another 500, 1,000 seats at the May elections, particularly with where the Labour Party are as well. So it's not about great strides, but it's about incremental gains, and that has to start at the next local elections. Just some level of progress.
And the second one, quite right, it's the Brexit one.
Of course it is.
I mean, the EU aren't going to give mutual recognition. What they'll say is you can align dynamically with us, which means if we change our rules, you change your rules.
Yep.
That's more of a concession in terms of sovereignty, isn't it?
Well, it depends. So this is the nuance of the point. It depends on the regulations we're talking about. So the reason I say anything, I use chemicals as a strong example, one, because I know a little bit more about it rather than some of the others that you might want to suggest. But if you look at chemicals, the chemical industry is not hugely dynamic. Mm-hmm. The technological development in the chemicals industry that would require a change in regulations, in relative terms, are quite glacial. So agreeing, say, dynamic alignment in chemicals, I'd be relatively relaxed in. But doing it, for example, in the tech economy or with AI, which is obviously quite topical in the EU at the minute, that might be more of a difficult conversation. Which is why I think, like I say, we've got to move beyond this idea of it's either dynamic alignment or nothing. It's like, well, hang on, let's look at the individual thing that we're talking about and see if we can compromise in finding a meeting of minds. And what, in reality, are we actually giving away? So, like I say, I don't see the chemical industry all of a sudden having some sort of technology revolution in the 10 years, which causes us a major problem if we were to agree dynamic alignment with the chemical industry.
But I suppose the big question is the party ready to have that conversation, do you think?
I don't know, but I think we need to be, and I think that depends on the leader of the party come November, because Brexit, until we get to that point, will always form part of the psyche, and we need to move beyond that and show a level of maturity to the wider public that it's done, and now we're looking to the future, and sensible EU policy is part of that.
Wonderful, thank you. Any more questions from... Oh, we're all over. Lady there, gentleman there. We'll fit the gentleman.
I'll try and keep it short.
We'll do those three before we run out of time.
Not that I can promise that I'll keep it short, but I'll try.
Yep.
So my name is Rosalind Gill. I'm from the National Centre for Universities and Business. And you've mentioned a few examples of things in Tees Valley that have helped to grow the economy. So things like carbon capture, the Freeport, they're all quite research innovation kind of active type of activities. And I'd be quite interested to hear what your views are on the economic growth policy of the new government and the role of research and innovation therein, and whether you believe the Conservatives should continue to be advocates of research and innovation and technologically driven growth over the next Parliament.
Yeah.
I'm Simon. I work in the dynamic chemical industry.
Oh. What are the chances? I know I've been found out, haven't I?
Not at all. One of the challenges we've got is that EU regulation has kind of moved on a bit, and companies in the UK, chemical companies who you know personally, the majority are foreign headquartered, and they've also moved on with different stuff that they've done, which is becoming a bit separate to some of the EU legislative direction. Sorry, I'll be quick. The EU challenge, I think, now is how do we, if we do that alignment, how do we have a say in the development of that regulation? Because if it goes too far to what companies are now ready for, the problem is we get caught up in that move, but we can't have any say in it. And we were an industry who, quite frankly, didn't want to leave because it's our biggest market.
That's right.
Connected question. When can we see companies like BP and INEOS building new chemical plants in the UK?
I'll take the last one first just because it's the quickest. I don't think you'll see INEOS build anything anytime soon, if ever, in the UK. And to be fair, they've had a policy and a direction of travel on chemicals in the UK for a number of years now. We had an INEOS nitrates plant on Teesside that closed a number of years ago. I mean, I was telling everybody years ago that he was going to close Grangemouth, and we've now seen the closure of Grangemouth. I appreciate it's becoming an import terminal. If people want to know the direction of travel with the potential of deindustrialisation of this country, go and read anything that Jim Ratcliffe's put out. It is worrying, and we need to readdress it. And it kind of goes to your point as well. It's one of the big problems we have, particularly with very large corporates in kind of big industrial sectors, is we don't have British brands anymore. And so, therefore, when you have large economic shocks, Teesside's a perfect example of this. We're a branch economy. We have huge investment in the billions of pounds from the likes of Saudi Aramco, SABIC, Huntsman in the chemical sector, for instance, etc., and many, many more, Ensus, to name just a few. And we've seen in Teesside over the years of the post-industrial era of a place like Teesside that when things go wrong for a company, or in global terms, businesses always retrench back to the centre and headquarters, and therefore places like Teesside are always subject to economic shocks. What we need is a better economic policy of trying to grow more indigenous businesses. And I'm going to get this in because I've said it at everything that I've been to, and it's really, really important. We are going to see this play out in the steel industry as well. So Port Talbot's just closed, despite this Labour government saying that if they were elected, they were going to protect the jobs. 3,000 jobs lost. Actually, another 2,500 on top of that in the supply chain. So more than 5,000 jobs lost in South Wales, which is devastating to that community. In the coming weeks, not months, in the coming weeks, and I can't believe I'm saying this as a Tory, this Labour government will oversee the end of steelmaking in the UK for the first time since the Industrial Revolution, because British Steel in Scunthorpe, the blast furnaces, are going to close. And this Labour government is going to allow it to happen. That is another 3,000 direct steel jobs at least, certainly more than 5,000 jobs entirely. And this is a great example of what you've just said, and the gentleman at the back more broadly in terms of how do we get these things back. As soon as you allow steelmaking to go in this country, I think it's extremely difficult to get it back. And we've just seen it happen yesterday, and I'm going to go on, take a liberty from Conholm and take a couple of minutes on this. Just yesterday, the government has sneaked out on their website that they've just given permission in Tata, who are the owners of Port Talbot in South Wales, who've just basically cost 5,000 people their jobs by closing the steelworks. They've just given them permission to import steel from India into the UK. They've just given that formal permission yesterday. In a few weeks, when they close Scunthorpe, you know what they're going to do? They're going to allow the Chinese to import steel from China into the UK, because we will not have any steelmaking capability in the UK. One, that's bad for local communities, particularly in those areas, deprived areas of this country, red wall areas of this country. They've all just voted Labour again, and I bet you they're regretting it. They said they were going to save British steel, and they're not going to. But actually, more importantly, that is an industry, a bit like the chemical industry, actually, which is a foundation industry, which is of national security importance. And how a Labour government are not going to support the transition of the steel industry to green steel, but keep the steel industry going until that transition has been made, is ultimately beyond me. And just to put a caveat on that, I do not blame the Secretary of State, Johnny Reynolds, for this, who is the man who ultimately has to make the decision on it. He has been dealt a duff hand, but the Treasury have turned around to him and said, you cannot have any money. So what the thing that the Labour Party are going to try and do, and they did it in Port Talbot, is they're going to say, we've just given them £500 million of our £2.5 billion green steel fund to build a new electric arc furnace. But what they're not telling you is they can't put a spade in the ground in Port Talbot for at least 5 years, probably longer. There's not going to be a single new steel job for 7 or 8 years, but they're never going to build it. Because why would Tata spend £1 billion of their own money, even if they're getting 500 million from the government, when they've just been allowed to import it from India, which is cheaper without all of the environmental regs and all of the problems that we would cause them if they're built in the UK? They're going to continue to do it. And the same is going to happen in Scunthorpe, and we're now going to be exposed to Chinese steel coming into the UK. And that causes, forget the, which are huge, by the way, the community impacts, the job impacts, the devastation on those communities. That is a really, really, really serious national security concern, and it is just not being talked about. I mean, the Secretary of State has already signalled this is about to happen, and nobody's talking about it. It's horrific. Watch out for it. And we've still got a few weeks to stop it, but unfortunately, I'm not confident. And then very quickly on the uni stuff, yes, of course we are. I should have done it the other way around, really. I just reached a crescendo and came back to the last question.
End on something more upbeat.
Well, no, when it comes to... Teesside's a really interesting example of this because we flirted with the idea of trying to attract more direct R&D, particularly through the university networks that are incredible right across the UK. And we talk about, obviously the country talks about the Golden Triangle a lot, particularly in this sense. We've figured out our niche in Teesside because we're the place where those technologies come to commercialise and grow, not just the pilot plants, but the at-scale plants. And we're seeing, actually, a lot of businesses based in the Golden Triangle, actually graduates coming out of places like UCL, etc., who are being told, if you want to start this company because you've come up with this great piece of research or an idea, tell you where you want to go to do it, go up to Teesside and go and speak to the universities, go and speak to CPI, go and speak to Marco and the team at the Institute about how you could commercialise that product and then export it. I think it's about Teesside, in Teesside's terms anyway, about us finding our niche and recognising that certainly in the short term we're not going to be able to compete with the likes of the Golden Triangle and the fantastic research universities like Keele and others as well, but they can't do what we can do. We can absolutely commercialise what's coming out of those great universities, create them into UK companies, keep the IP and the ownership in the UK, make sure we can manage those economic shocks, and that just seems to me like a much more sensible economic policy to follow.
Ben, Lord Houchen, we've run out of time, I'm afraid. I've literally got another 20 questions I wanted to get through, so I hope we can invite you back at some other time to keep the conversation going. Thanks as ever to Con Home. It's been a pleasure, as it is every year. Thank you all for coming, and could you show your appreciation to Ben Houchen, please? Thank you. Enjoy that.
Yeah, I didn't go and put it too long.
You're absolutely